Thank you very much. And where is Jimmy? Jimmy, would you come up here with me? I have stage fright unless Jimmy's next to me. This is Jimmy Jordan Robinson, one of the heroes of New London, and certainly one of the folks that helped give this book strength. I'm a pretty good writer. I've made my living that way for years. But without the stories that Jimmy related to me and so many other people, the survivors, the rescue workers, this book could have never come to be. Do you want to sit up here, or do you want to sit back there with you?
Right here.
Okay, that'd be good, so you can get me straight. This is a book. It's got my little markers in it because I've been giving some talks. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Used to live in this lovely part of East Texas, but I got a newspaper job up there and had to go make a living. And we had a real good kickoff in Pittsburgh with people interested about this explosion. They had no clue that anything like this had ever happened, involving mainly children. You know, explosions you hear about all the time, and terrible things in wars, and nowadays some of these crazy school shootings that. But this disaster, in and of itself, was unique, and as far as I know, is still unique. And Walter Cronkite, before he died, said that. He said this was the most tragic story that he covered in his life, excluding some of the wartime things that he was involved in and couldn't classify as tragedy or horror or what have you. But this one story, when he was in Dallas, and he came from Dallas to New London with his bureau chief. He was 22 years old. He had no idea what to expect. When he left, he'd bottled up all these emotions, and he had been blunt in ways that reporters are, and we hear you saying those reporters, you know, they're all too nosy and they get their. Well, reporters are sometimes brash and overdo it, but thank goodness for Cronkite and a courageous man named Felix McKnight, who was an Associated Press reporter out of Dallas, and Sarah McClendon, who was out of Tyler and went on to become very famous covering presidents. Just a whole host of news media came down and got right in the thick of this, and fairly graciously balanced doing their job, which was reporting the news, with helping as they could in the rescue and recovery mission. Being a reporter myself, I was very fascinated with what they were facing going about trying to get this story out. It's the type scene that if you were to walk up on it, I can't imagine any of us in this room wouldn't just feel like collapsing and dying, as one man did. One rescue worker, he parked his car and he went running over to the destruction and collapsed, and died later that night of a heart-related illness. But it was not for the Henderson Daily News, but I was living in Henderson and writing as a freelance writer for the Longview News Journal in the late 80s, early 90s, and the Henderson Daily News had an anniversary issue on the 50th anniversary of the explosion, and I had never heard of it, which surprised me because I had been a reporter since 1970 and was fairly well read and felt as though I were a little bit sophisticated when it came to big things that had happened. And I went to the library. I found a couple of books that related to it but didn't really tell you what happened. One was a memoir that a woman had written of her experiences, and as those type books goes, it was interesting. The other was written by a Methodist minister, excuse me, Baptist and Methodist, that was at the school that they had exploded. He was actually supposed to be inside the school, and his name was Robert L. Jackson. He was referred to yesterday in the memorial talk at New London. And he was a courageous man, and he just felt that there needed to be a record. And so Reverend Jackson went to students and talked to them about their experiences, and he wrote a valuable record as best he could of what happened, what experiences the students could share. And both those books, while they're incomplete, were helpful in this book. But beyond that, there was not another book. So I wrote an article for the Longview News-Journal. I started interviewing people who were in the explosion. In 1987, I started my interviews. I started researching it as much as I could. There were no files on it. The only file I could find was in New London, at the New London School, in the library, and in their administrative office. They had a vault, and the vault had a collection of documents and memorabilia that had been left over from the explosion, and it was eerie. It was as though they were opening a tomb. And I did work up a draft of it and had a publishing contract in the 1990s, but the publisher went out of business before I finished the book. That took the wind out of my sails. I resurrected the project a few years later, and enlisted the help of a friend and a fellow reporter named Michael Wershagen, who was there yesterday and the day before. He had to fly back today. But Mike's younger than me, and I'd been sort of his mentor at the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, and we were the two lead writers for the newspaper. They assigned us as a team, and we'd worked together on many stories. Outside of that, Mike had been dispatched to major disasters, contemporary disasters, because he was such a good, quick reporter, and he had a way of talking to people and getting close to them without seeming intrusive, like a lot of reporters do seem bullying. Mike doesn't have that edge. And so I asked him would he like to join me in the final phase of writing this book, and he agreed. And Mike came out here to East Texas and did some of his own investigation, and went to the museum and went to the monument and went to the cemetery, and he came back full of inspiration. And then he and I started writing. It took us 3 years to write it. It's kind of an epic disaster book in that it doesn't take just one person and follow them through the day. What we did was take as much and as many characters as we could, and early in the book set them on a path toward what was going to be happening that afternoon. And all their stories converge around 3/17 when the school exploded. And as you might imagine, the story from that point on is the horror. The section of that book's called Terror, because it's the most terrifying thing you can imagine. This explosion was way beyond anything you could do with just a few sticks of dynamite. The school was 250 feet long. It was 2 stories. The first floor was 1 floor, but then it went down an embankment and became 2 stories. At the time of the explosion, no one knows exactly how many children and teachers were in there. Somewhere, it's been estimated, maybe as many as 700, as few as 500. A lot of students were out that day. The next day was going to be a holiday. It had been declared a day off for students, just a free holiday, because they were having interscholastic contests with all of the schools in the county, and these students were just raring and ready to go. I talked to quite a few survivors who were students, and they could remember that so well. They were just ready to get out of there and have their 3-day holiday. And Jimmy was over in the elementary school. She was 7 years old. She was her classes got out a little early, and so she was, as she usually did, she walked over to meet with her sister Elsie. And Elsie was in the junior, it was a combined junior-senior high school just adjacent to the elementary. And just about the time you got there, and hadn't even had time to say anything to Elsie, as I recall, the lights went out.
I had been at the PTA meeting.
That's right. She diverted around and went to the PTA meeting. PTA meeting was in the gym. It was a wooden structure, an old-fashioned gym, where there were about 50 to 60 mothers having their regular monthly PTA meeting, but it was a special program. This day, the elementary school had organized entertainment involving many of the elementary school students in a program called Dances of the World. The PTA meeting began at 3 o'clock. The dances, the teachers and parents were walking in, and all the students were in line waiting to go in. Just a whole big herd of children. And they were dressed in all sorts of uniforms and outfits. Some of them were little Native Americans with feathers coming up, and they had headdress and Indian-type costumes, and others were dressed as little Spaniards and Spanish women, and they had castanets that were clicking everywhere. And they were also going to do a minuet, so you had some very formal dressed little students to do the minuet. And the grand finale was the Mexican hat dance. So you can imagine how those mothers felt as they were going in, seeing all their little children. All these children had brothers and sisters in the bigger building. And Billy made a detour around over by that, and then you headed back to your sister's class. So she was one of the youngest people. You were 7?
No, yeah, I'm 7, almost 6.
You were 7. And she walked in, was just standing in the doorway of her sister's room when the whole world, as all those children knew it, disintegrated. Under that building, there had been a natural gas leak. It's still debated today as to the hows and whys, but we do know that it was a pipeline that ruptured. It had a natural gas that was what was called residue gas or waste gas. It was a little more volatile than refined natural gas that typically is used by refineries, by distributors. And it had leaked into the 250-foot crawl space of that school, end to end. The crawl space only had 2 little vents, 2 little windows, because it was not designed at all for natural gas heat. The building was designed to be heated by steam heat, pumped in from a boiler room separate from the school. But in the process of building the school, a heater salesman came by and sold the board on the use of individual space gas heaters in every room. So it had this pipe that ruptured, and this gas spewed out. It had been spewing little bits of it over a week or so. They knew that because some of the children were complaining about stinging eyes and headaches, and the school board and the superintendent, Chesley Shaw, they were frantically searching for the causes of this. And they had not related it to gas. There was no real smell to gas. Natural gas has a very, very faint odor, but not anything like what you smell if your pilot light goes off. And particularly, remember, they were in a boom town where there was oil and gasoline and all sorts of smells. So they didn't notice any odd smells. And by the time this crawl space filled up with 64,000 cubic feet mixture of air and natural gas, and it expanded, the barometer was dropping, and it was ignited by a spark from the industrial arts room, the shop, when a shop teacher, he pulled a switch down to apply electricity to a sander, and the spark was so tiny that one student saw it, but it was like the spark you see today if you, say, go plug in an outlet and you see that little quick spark when that circuit completes. It was that kind of spark. It set off the equivalent of 70 pounds of TNT and or dynamite strapped beneath every square foot of that building, exploding at the same moment. That was the power. A physicist did that equation for us. 70 pounds of dynamite under every square foot went off at the same time. That was the horror. The rest of the story is the survival and the courage of the people who came to help and who put all their personal fear and terror aside long enough to get into those ruins and try to find any child who was there who was still alive. They knew that many, many were killed. It was apparent instantly that hundreds of children were killed. 2 chapters in this book deal with one of my favorite topics, and that was the heroic role taken by Mother Frances Hospital that afternoon. Hospital was not quite ready. They were scheduled, they were preparing to open the next day. And while I had read that, I went back and I read all the clips before and after the explosion, and it always said Mother Frances Hospital was supposed to open the next day. Instead, they opened a day early. But I really didn't know what all was going on until I did the historical research with the help of Mother Frances Hospital and the Sisters of the Holy Family. Tremendous help in going back into archives. We found a document that actually was from one of the sisters who wrote about that day before the explosion. And the sisters were charged with getting the place spick and span. And they were busy everywhere. They were getting dishes, brand new dishes out of crates that had never been used and washing them. They didn't want to take a chance on any speck of dirt being on those dishes. They were washing them again. They were washing, they had an automatic washer. They had a dishwasher too, but I suspect they didn't use the dishwasher. They probably just washed them by hand. But they did have an automatic clothes washer, and they washed all the brand new towels and sheets. They washed them. You know, brand new or not, they had them all washed and ready. They had every single room made up, ready to go. And there was only one room that was out of order in that whole hospital. It was the sisters' quarters. They had piled everything in that room that they couldn't figure out what to do with into their room with where their beds were, their shoes, their clothes. Everything was just heaped in there like a mountain. And they figured they would do that early the next day. And besides that, nobody would get to see that, and they were hoping and praying that nobody would see it before they had a chance to straighten it up. And the sisters in charge of that hospital, when they heard the school exploded, they didn't wait for the bishop to get there to make a decision. The Bishop of Dallas, Bishop Lynch, was en route by train to Mother Frances to be there for the grand opening. They said, bring the children here. Bring them now. And 20 hospital-trained nurses, sisters, were sent to the site immediately and instructed to do as much as they could there and then to return the hospital with victims, taking care of victims on the way back. That's one of the most powerful stories, I think, in human history. One other little thing about the hospital, and I'm going to shut up. My wife says I talk way too long at these things, and I don't want to, but I like to tell the story. You can see that. There's a little boy named Walter Freeman. Walter was a little country boy that he lived in the woods way away from London and took a bus to school. And there were no Catholics nearby where he lived. As most of you know, there were not many Catholics here in Tyler. But Walter, he'd never heard of a nun. And he was seriously hurt. He was in a room where most of the children were killed. Walter woke up, his back was broken, all of his ribs were cracked. He was coming in and out of consciousness because he had a brain concussion. And he was still struggling to pull. He could see a little patch of light. He was kind of in a down area of the school, like we're at sort of the basement area. And he pulled with his elbows and his shoulders and his chest as much as he could. He was going in and out of excruciating pain to light that he saw. And he was really annoyed because when the things blew all around him, somehow a stick blew into his arm. And he kept trying to get it out. And he kept pulling on it and pulling on it and pulling on it until he realized it was bone. But Walter wakes up. It's in a chapter of Mother Frances. Walter Freeman couldn't help but wonder time and again if he was going in and out of a dream. He'd been at school and was knocked down and hurt badly when the room collapsed. The nightmare next put him in the midst of other students groaning and dying, and Walter tried to say something, ask some questions, but his voice was very weak. Then he awoke in an ambulance with a siren blaring, feeling it swerve to take a steep curve. Now it seemed an angel was gazing down at him. A black hood with a white collar curved around the beautiful oval of her face. She smiled at him. He wanted to say something, but still felt deflated, too tired even to say hello. He heard the voices of men, his father in work clothes and a doctor in a white lab coat standing in the doorway of the hospital room. "Is he going to make it?" Mr. Freeman asked. "If he makes it through the night, I think so," the doctor said. Although Walter didn't know what she was doing or what she was, since he had never seen a nun, he felt comforted by the sister as she swabbed his head injuries and gently probed his chest and arms. She was preparing the boy for surgery to repair the compound fracture in one arm and place a cast around his entire body from head to toe with slits for his eyes, nose, and mouth. His broken back and cracked ribs were not believed to be life-threatening. Doctors were most concerned about the concussion. Walter Freeman soon drifted back to a semi-conscious state, mixing the reality of his surroundings with dreamlike images, unaware that he was one of the first patients in the new Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler. So, hope y'all like that little story. I interviewed Walter, and those paragraphs, that narrative is built from his actual words. It's not fiction. So, with that, I'll be happy to let Jimmy say something if she would like to. Jimmy's story is so powerful. People have told me that it's the most powerful story in the book. I don't want to tell it all today. But I will tell this bit, that the room collapsed on her. She didn't know what had happened. Her sister Elsie came looking for her.
My sister Elsie has these sisters, this order of sisters, to thank because they took care of her while I was being dug out, so to speak, because she would not leave the building. She was conscious all the way through the explosion. And she knew where I was in the building, but all she could see was my hands. and they came to remove the debris and try to find the children that they could. And she wouldn't let them dig me up. She said she wouldn't leave until they did dig me out. So she stayed there until they got me out, and they took her to Mother Frances Hospital. But they took me to Bryant's Clinic, and because a brain specialist was due to come in that night from Dallas, and I now still have a hole right here. And this doctor came in and said, at Bryant's Clinic, I was his first patient, and he said, I'm going to take all the bone out of her, this round hole I had in my head. And if she lives until the morning, she may make it. I'm still here today. But the funny part about this story is that my sister didn't believe anybody because my mother and father were separated in Overton when she stayed with her, and they said I had to have a brain specialist. Well, my dad put me in an ambulance, and we came to Tyler. And I was Dr. Diorica's first patient. He was a brain specialist from Dallas. And she was brought in later and came to Mother Frances. And she was here, but she wanted to know where I was. And they told him where I was. She said, I got to see her. So I think the sisters...
She didn't think you were alive.
She didn't think I was alive. She didn't believe them because she saw the big hole I had in my head. And so with both of us bandaged, almost identical. She was this way with bandages, and I was this way with bandages. So they brought her over there to me, to Bryant's Clinic. She walked up to me and she said, is that you, Jimmy? And I said, is that you, Elsie? We both said, hey! And so that was our getting back together again. But she did come back over here and stay with the sisters, and I'm ever so grateful to them. I saw Dr. Diorica one more time, and that was all. I've lived with this hole in my head ever since.
And Elsie watched over you the rest of your life.
The rest of my life. She dictated every move I made.
And to show you just how much of a team all this stuff is, I mean, my name's on the book and Mike's, but it's all teamwork. This was a team with everybody I knew in East Texas, my wife, just so many people, but also Robert Hilliard. His website is how I found Billy. She had written him a letter. He put it on the website. I regularly check Robert's website because he has one of the best websites anywhere about the school explosion. And I read this letter that day and I thought, oh, this couldn't be true. This is such an amazing story. And then I tracked Billy down and I learned it was Jimmy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Jimmy. I tracked Jimmy down. I'll tell you why. There's a Billy too that reminds me of you. She was there that day too. But Jimmy, I tracked Jimmy down, and the story was so, and she agreed to the interview. Not only the interview, but she went on live radio on KDKX and KDAK in Pittsburgh and did an hour-long interview, and the people of Pittsburgh were just delighted to hear her story.
Well, there's one thing that I think I need to say that on behalf of the Red Cross. The Red Cross was everywhere when that explosion occurred. They accompanied my sister and I to Dallas when we had to go see the specialist after it was all over with, and they had tried to sew her eyelid back together. My sister was not hurt until she tried to dig me out. And glass fell on her and cut her right eyelid in half. So she had to make several trips to Dallas. And the Red Cross accompanied us on every trip. And if you go to the museum in the village where they have books that tell the story, page after page after page, where the Red Cross paid for burials for children. And so I guess I've always looked up to what the Red Cross does. Sometimes they get a bad reputation, but this is one event that they really came forward. And I think we should all be appreciative of it. And the sisters, of course, were wonderful, as they always are. I liked them so well. I worked for the Diocese of Galveston-Houston for 20 years. But the Red Cross did do a good job, and I'd like to put in that plug for them.
Well, the Salvation Army did too.
Yes, they did also.
There were a lot of heroes, the Boy Scouts, the American Legion. Any and everybody who could offer something came there that day.
They took in the parents, the people in took in parents, and they stayed there. My parents got separated, and that's how my mother stayed with Elsie, and he stayed with me. And the people in the various parts of this area just were wonderful. Just couldn't be better.
I'll be happy to answer anybody's questions. I don't know what our time is like, and I do think I have one book over here.
You really need this book because I've read it, and it's extremely good, and it really tells a story.
It's sold a lot faster than anybody anticipated, than the publisher anticipated, when we came into Longview, actually it started selling down in Houston. This is the second week I've been in Texas, and they literally almost sold out in this area. I don't know, there may be at Barnes & Noble's, but I do have one here if someone wants to buy that one. I think one or two. I've got one that I've stuck all my notes on that nobody would want. But the fastest way to get them, if you want a book, and I'm a writer, not a salesman, but I told this story, so I should tell you how to get it, is Amazon.com. I think that's the quickest and probably the least expensive. Anybody quick questions or no questions?